Okay, thank you very much, Venerable Bhikkhuni, for leading the meditation, and Manuri for introducing me in such a, warm way. Thank you very much. Please raise your hand if you, at any point, you can't hear me. I've been told to use this as an ice cream cone, so let's hope it works. And for the Zoom participants as well. So in conversation with Manuri, I chose this title for my talk today: British Translators of the Pali Texts in the Colonial Period, Search for Accuracy. Now we'll see if I can get it to move on. Good. So that this is the plan of my presentation this afternoon. First of all, I'm going to say a few words about the context in which the first British translators worked in Sri Lanka, that colonial context. Then going to give some theoretical considerations about the very act of translation, because this is a most important background to my talk. Then some thoughts about the different agendas the British brought to their translating, which conditioned their work and certainly conditioned whether their work was accurate as we look back at it. Then I'm going to focus on some key doctrinal terms to illustrate the variety of translations that came during the British period and the preconceptions that kind of nurtured these translations. So why should I choose this topic? Well, I did my doctorate in Sri Lanka, as Manuri said, and it was on the encounter between the British and Buddhism, particularly how the British represented Buddhism. I completed it in 1993, but I didn't get a publication out until 2007 because of various things that were happening in my life. And it came out as a book entitled Theravada Buddhism and the British Encounter, Religious, Missionary and Colonial Experience in 19th Century Sri Lanka. Now, since then, and I can't believe it's 20 years ago this year, since that book was published, I've drawn different themes from the book and gone into greater depth concerning them. And one theme was the translations, particularly of Christian missionaries. And I draw on these articles. So the context. And of course, the context was primarily driven by the power relationships of imperialism, which meant that the British translators never saw themselves as completely on an equal playing field with the people of Sri Lanka or with Buddhism. But quite a number of civil servants sought to understand the culture and religion of colonial Ceylon. One could argue that it was to better control the island. You have to know about the people in order to govern them. And two of the first, I would say, prominent civil servants who sought to understand Buddhism and the total culture of Sri Lanka were Alexander Johnston, who was Chief Justice here between 1811 and 1818, and someone you may not have heard of, Joseph de Joinville, quite an enigmatic character, but he wrote one of the first articles on Buddhism that was published in the Indian subcontinent. It was published by Asiatic Researches, and he drew on singular material, and no doubt he was in dialogue with members of the monastic community and others on this material. So the civil servants were the first category of people who were here engaging with Buddhism. The second category were the evangelical Christian missionaries who had arrived from 1807 onwards. And many of them were scholars. They learnt Sinhala, certainly, and some learnt Pali as well. And their aim was to better understand Buddhism, but not to communicate that understanding in a positive way, to undermine it, because, of course, their agenda was to convert. But both these categories, civil servants and Christian missionaries, drew on the expertise of the Sri Lankan monastic Sangha. There was a kind of continuity of lineage there in terms of their informants and their helpers. The third group, of course, were the Theosophists, who arrived after 1880, and I know some of you will know the history of this, but they arrived to stand alongside Buddhists and to support Buddhist revivalism in the country. So these three kind of categories of people were present in Sri Lanka in the 19th century. There were, of course, also planters and members of the military, but in terms of translations of Buddhist texts, these were the three most important. Now, theoretical considerations about translation. Oh dear, I'm not supposed to be there. And I suppose my most important point is that scholars would say that translation is interpretation. It's always interpretation. One of the most important voices in the 20th century was Edward Said. Some of you will know of his book called Orientalism, in which he argued powerfully that when a powerful West seeks to translate the East to the West, there is always distortion. There is always manipulation because power always gets into it. And others have followed up on his argument. And when I wrote some years ago an article on Daniel Gogerly, a Methodist Wesleyan missionary, and his translation, I drew on Emily Apter's work, her publication of a book called The Translation Zone, and her argument that, yes, at best, if you're translating one culture to another or a text in one language into another language, translation at best is about discernment, negotiation, reciprocity. At its worst, it's about concealment, hidden agendas, and manipulation. I think all these elements can be found in the translations of the British in my period. So, translation as interpretation. Interpretation, I would say, is conditioned by, yes, the culture of the translator, the agenda of the translator's preconceptions about Buddhism, what he or she brings to the Buddhist texts, and also the dialogues that the translators were having with local expertise, particularly members of the monastic Sangha. So these are some of the early British translators that I'm going to concentrate on, some more than others. Benjamin Clough, he was one of the first Wesleyan Methodist missionaries to arrive in Sri Lanka in 1914. And he wrote, or compiled, that's a better word, one of the first deep singular dictionaries, singular English dictionaries. And he also translated, with the help of others, a Pali grammar. So someone who worked in Sinhala and Pali, and I've been in contact with a person called David Drews in the States, who has written quite an authoritative article on Benjamin Clough, arguing that he was one of the first kind of Orientalists who took seriously this kind of act of translation, of interpreting, of moving between Sinhala and English and Pali and English. Daniel Gogerly, also a Wesleyan Methodist missionary, he became a better expert in Pali than Clough and did far more translations of the Pali texts and published them in Sri Lanka through the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society and in a Wesleyan Methodist journal called The Friend. And he was really a forerunner of some of the others on my slide there, and I'll refer to him later. Robert Childers lived a very short life. He was civil servant in Sri Lanka and had to return to Britain because of ill health. And he wrote, again, compiled is a much better word, but what is regarded by Pali scholars as a very good dictionary of the Pali language. He was in communication with two notable Buddhist monks at the time and always tested his work against their expertise. And the dictionary was published in 2 volumes, 1972 and not 1972, 1872 and 1875, forgive me. And according to his wife, he put so much effort into his dictionary that this, in fact, shortened his life because he didn't have great health. But Robert Childers, a real pioneer. Thomas William Rhys-Davids, you know of him, I'm sure. He was founder of the Pali Text Society in 1881 and spent some time in Sri Lanka as a civil servant, left under rather a cloud, and there has been a biography written about this, but in England devoted himself to the study of Pali and setting up the Pali Text Society, gathering around him a very committed group of translators, and also being instrumental in the first Buddhist Society of Britain and Ireland that was created in 1907. So Rhys-Davids, John Frederick Dixon, someone you probably haven't heard about, another civil servant who worked in Sri Lanka, but then went on to what was then the Straits Settlement, Singapore. Now, he was a contester of the missionaries, as I'll stress later, learned Pali, was president of the Royal Asiatic Society, translated an Upasampada ceremony and also Patimokkha, and concentrated on what kind of drove and inspired ordinary Buddhists in the country. Lastly, Frank Lee Woodward, a theosophist. And some of you may have heard of him. He was principal of Mahinda College. He responded to Colonel Olcott's call for people to come and help the Buddhist revival. And a remarkable man, son of a Christian minister, but then converted to theosophy, came out to Sri Lanka to help Colonel Olcott and was principal of Mahinda College in Gaul, transformed the school and became a considerable Pali scholar, one of the group of translators that Rhys-Davids gathered around him. So here we've got pictures of this group. In the top left-hand corner, Benjamin Clough, going down into the middle with the round kind of photograph. That is Thomas William Rhys-Davids with his wife, Caroline Foley, who became, of course, Mrs. Rhys-Davids, who was a scholar in her own right of Buddhist studies, and at least there's one woman in there. Then we go to Frederick Dixon on the top right corner, going down to the bottom left. That's Frank Lee Woodward, and the bottom right is Daniel Gogerly. So what were their agendas? I'll take 3 people and just to kind of tease out some of the agendas. Daniel Gogerly, he was a missionary who sought converts to Christianity. In his writings on the practice of Buddhism, he wasn't very complimentary, and I've written about this in his letters home to the Home Society. No, he wasn't complimentary, but he did believe that Buddhists would only take Christianity seriously if Christians took Buddhism seriously. He did seek to be fair, and I've got to be fair to him by saying that. He spent all of his life in Sri Lanka, never going back to Britain, married 4 times, had 2 children, one of whom married a singular woman. One of his sons married a singular woman. So there are Morogoda Gogerlys in Sri Lanka to this day, going back to Daniel. But yes, he sought to be fair to Buddhism in his own way. For instance, one of his early pieces of writing was a piece in which he warned other missionaries not to call exorcism devil dancing. And the early missionaries saw the rituals that Buddhists did with drumming and masks, the kind of rituals, and they dubbed them devil dancing, worship of the devil. Gogerly said, no, you're wrong. They're exorcisms. Get your facts right. And of course, as you know, they are. Evil is being driven out. Sickness is being driven out through these rituals, conquered. So he would kind of chastise the missionaries in some way, and but he also wanted to advocate for Christianity. And I did a study a few years ago on his translations of the Dhammapada, and there are 3 versions. I found a rough translation in the Royal Asiatic Society archives in London, penned in his own handwriting, his first translation of the Dhammapada. Then it was published in a Wesleyan Methodist magazine that was printed here, The Friend. That was the second version. And then the third version was printed after his death posthumously in a collection of his writings, and some changes were made at each stage. Now, in these translations, he translated neutrally verses not in competition with Christianity, verses about ethics. The Christian missionaries felt that religion was about belief, not about action. You had to believe. And so that Buddhist ethics was similar to Christian ethics didn't worry him. It wasn't a competitive site. And he didn't mess with verses that missionaries, which were about topics that missionaries felt were inferior to Christianity, such as karma. Now, again, you've got to get into a Christian mindset there to understand why. Because the principle of karma states that there will always be a fruit to our actions. We cannot actually escape that. And the Christians were saying, no, there's forgiveness. There's forgiveness. But he would misrepresent verses, as I'll try to show, that could compete with Christianity, or that he did not completely understand. So that was his agenda. What about Dixon, the civil servant? Different agenda completely. He was attracted to Buddhist practice because he found it attractive. He knew Pali, but he went to the text for secondary information. I've already said he translated the Patimokkha and the Pasamutta that were published in Britain. His main agenda was to challenge negative missionary portrayals. So you've got a kind of dialogue between the different British in the 19th century. They're contesting each other. They're disagreeing with each other. In one of his articles, he wrote, Buddhism, I quote, lives enshrined in the hearts of a pious, simple, and kindly people. It leads them through a life of charity to a peaceful deathbed, such as most Christians may envy. Having conquered desire, they enjoy a repose that cannot be disturbed. So this is what he saw in the 1880s in Colonial Ceylon. So conversion was unnecessary, and I would say he thought it was unethical as well. That was Dixon. What about Woodward? Well, as I said, he came to Buddhism through theosophy and offered help to Colonel Olcott and becoming principal of my Hindu college. Some of his translations for the Pali Text Society are still on the Pali Text Society's lists. They've lasted that long. And his aim was for objective translation that would highlight the positive and life-giving elements in Buddhism. He had difficulty with some concepts, concepts such as anatta, and I'll come to that later because theosophists as a whole had difficulties with the idea of anatta, non-self, and I'll come later. So with the 3 people I've just highlighted, you had 3 agendas. And so when you've got the 3 agendas, translation becomes a zone of contest about the meaning and practice of Buddhism. And how doctrinal terms were translated was conditioned by preconceptions about Buddhism as a whole. Different preconceptions, different translations. Not a kind of linear journey towards accuracy, but something a little bit more messy and complex. So these were some of the Pali terms that were contested and translated in different ways. Nibbana, anatta, dukkha, tanha, bhavana and jhana, karma, avarino, appamada. And I'm going to take some of these as examples of the contest over translation. And of course, it brings in the contests over what actually Buddhism means and what Buddhism is. So first of all, Nibbana. Yes, we would say that the texts speak of it as the highest bliss, and that literally it means to blow out or to go out. And it's a term which has no direct translation in English. Liberation, yes. Enlightenment, yes, but there's no direct equivalent. You can say, okay, Nibbana means this in English, means that in German. No, it's more complex. Now, the early missionaries were convinced that Nibbana was annihilation, cessation of being. They kind of seized on what their informants were saying about Nibbana as the going out. And they assumed it was the going out of the whole person, the whole slipping into what the Buddha actually criticized, annihilationism. But they were convinced that Nibbana was annihilation, cessation of being. Now, and I think I should say at this point that my work on the Christian missionaries has led me to respect them as people and to, they're a pretty hardy lot and had a lot of enthusiasm, but they were imprisoned in a theology that many Christians now wouldn't agree with. But they, yes, the missionaries were convinced that Nibbana was annihilation, cessation of being. Gogoli's representation in the three versions of the Dhammapada. In the first version, I think he's the wisest. He didn't translate nirvana. He calls it nirvana rather than nibbana, doesn't translate it. Later on, he does, and his translations are extinction or ceasing to exist. Of course, in nibbana, there is an extinction. There isn't a ceasing to exist. There's a ceasing to exist of craving, of greed, hatred, and delusion, but that wasn't what Gogoli meant. And so in verse 126 of the Dhammapada, which speaks about those without asavas, the corruptions going to nibbana, Gogoli translates this as those without desire become extinct. And verse 202 is a verse which speaks of peace, santi, as a synonym of nibbana. Gogoli ignores the santi completely, translates nati santiparam sukham as there being no good equal to the ceasing to exist. You see how his preconceptions affect his translations underscore the negative qualities of Buddhism, or what he saw as the negative qualities of Buddhism. Now, Gogoli almost set the bench line. Robert Childers comes along and says, I'm going to settle the matter. And this is what he says in his dictionary, that he's going to settle the contested nature of Nibbana. And he says, well, it has two meanings. The first meaning is the bliss of the Arahat in this life. And all the positive epithets of Nirvana that you get in the texts, bliss, happiness, security, and so on, you can name them. That's the bliss of the Arahat in this life. But he said, at the end, in Parinibbana, it is annihilation of existence. So he's kind of contesting Gogoli, but not completely. T.W. Rhys Davids, well, I can't find much about Parinibbana in his writings, but he expanded Childers' view and switches it around so that it becomes extremely positive. Nirvana is therefore the same thing as a sinless, calm state of mind, and if translated at all, may best perhaps be rendered holiness. That was his preferred translation. Holiness. That is, in the Buddhist sense, perfect peace, goodness, and wisdom. So again, a direct contesting of some of the negative translations there in Rhys Davids. Now, what were the effect of Gogoli's view and Gogoli's translations on those who came after him. And I think there's a slide missing. Yeah, sorry about that. This is the next category, moving on from Nibbana to Anatta. Now, the first British people to come to Sri Lanka assumed that Buddhists believed in transmigration of the soul, similar to Hindu traditions. Clough, for instance, says in his Sinhala dictionary, Nibbana is the final emancipation of the soul. Some British people, through their dialogue with members of the monastic Sangha, realized that it was something more than this. I'm not going to say much about John Davey because he wasn't a translator, but he was posted in Kandy in the first part of the 19th century and had a lot of dialogue with monks there. And some of the monks were saying, well, it's much more subtle. It's like a breath that kind of goes across lives. It's not a soul. And he records this. But he wasn't dealing with the texts in any way. Gogoli, through his reading of the text and his knowledge of Pali, thinks he has discovered anatta in his translating. He doesn't think that many Buddhists in colonial Ceylon actually knew anything about it, but he finds it in the texts and projects onto it his own Christian conditioning and says that anatta means no soul. Not no self, not non-self or not self, no soul. And if you can put yourself into Gogoli's position, as someone who believes in Christianity, he then saw this as proof of the negative nature of Buddhism. It argues it proved the nihilism of Buddhism. So he used it. And in fact, all of you know about the Panadura debate. The Christian debater, David de Silva, was a pupil of Gogoli and used this argument about anatta to challenge Mahathir Bunananda. But so you've got Gogoli laying down that the concept of anatta exists and that it's negative. And all of you here would completely disagree, I know. So Gogoli goes into some gymnastics into his translations. I mean, in the Dhammapada, there is an Attavaga, a chapter on the self, as you probably know. And when he translates this, he almost bends over backwards not to use the word self at all. He says, of course, there can't be a self in Buddhism. There can't be an act. So he doesn't use that. He uses himself, yes, forgets about herself, but uses himself, but not self. And subsequent translators are kind of forced to engage with him in this. So Childers' translation in his dictionary is that anatta is not a self, not a soul. So we can't move away from Gogoli completely, not a self, not a soul. Rhys Davids, something more akin to what Buddhists in Sri Lanka would understand, comes into the translation process. He nuanced Gogoli, using no self, and he presents it in the total context of Buddhist doctrine. This is one quote from his writing, in which he's arguing that it's the logical consequence of anicca, impermanence. Anatta flows from anicca. And I still tell my students this. As the relation of its component parts, in other words, the component parts of the body and mind, as the relation of its component parts one to another is ever changing, so it is never the same for two consecutive moments. And no sooner has separateness, individuality begun, than dissolution, disintegration also begins. So he's kind of placing no self in the context of this, in the context of anicca. Now, Woodward Theosophists, what did the Theosophists believe? Well, those who came to Sri Lanka would have been brought up and formed through the idea that we each have a soul and that the soul evolves through numerous lives to liberation. they found the concept of anatta very difficult. They contested representations of Buddhism that stressed anatta. I mean, 2 years ago, I was speaking about Alan Bennett and Nanda Meitaya. The biography is out now. I've got a copy here for you to have a look at if you want. But Alan Bennett and Nanda Meitaya, anatta for him was extremely important. He felt the ills of the world could be kind of explained through clinging to the self. And so that the teaching of anatta in Buddhism was liberating, and he'd been a theosophist before he became a Buddhist. And throughout his life, he was in conversation with theosophists about anatta. And some of the theosophists were very critical of him, saying, how can you say that no self is the most important doctrine in Buddhism? It's the false self that has to be destroyed, not the real self. We all have a real self. So contestation about anatta. But Woodward, yes, began as a theosophist and no doubt came to Sri Lanka with the theosophist concept of a real self and a false self. But in Sri Lanka, he really did pass over into Buddhism, becoming an expert in Pali, and then being able to translate anatta as non-self. I'm going on to dukkha. Again, there's no exact equivalence in English. Is it suffering, pain, misery, unsatisfactoriness, anguish, existential anguish, if you want to link it to the existentialists? Is an ideal term for translators to project onto it their own preconceptions. Now, suffering became the standard translation. Misery, a close second. And this is across all categories of translators. But saying that dukkha means suffering or is defined through the concept of suffering, again, that could feed into the negative in terms of representations of Buddhism. I mean, there was one horrific missionary who wrote that Buddhists see life as a curse to be destroyed. You know, nothing but suffering. Got it completely wrong. What about, human birth as being precious as a strand right throughout the Buddhist texts and throughout the whole of Buddhism? But no, that dukkha was translated as suffering, kind of led into these negative representations and translations. But yes, dukkha, Rhys Davids, I'm going back to him. He, of course, contested the view that dukkha means that all of life is suffering. His preferred translation was sorrow. Don't know what you feel about that. Is dukkha sorrow? We could debate that afterward, but his preferred translation was sorrow. And he saw it as contingent. And he wrote, sorrow is in fact the result of the effort which an individual has to make to keep separate from the rest of existence. Sorrow comes when we cut ourselves off from others, rely on the ego, on the I, on the mine, and cut ourselves off from everyone else. So it's a kind of, yes, he's working with the concept of craving there, and the craving to remain a me kind of thing, and saying that, yes, sorrow, dukkha, results from that. So dukkha, the cause of dukkha, tanha. Now, I know some of my diacriticals are not showing there because this computer had to be put back to its factory condition and the diacriticals just weren't there. But anyway, so tanha should have a diacritical under the N, but couldn't find it. But anyway, tanha. The normative translation, of course, is craving or thirst. And tanha is fueled by greed, hatred, and delusion, standard. But it was not always translated as craving or thirst by the British translators. Their translations were conditioned by whether the Four Noble Truths were represented as nihilistic or liberating. And again, there was contestation. And almost the most popular word that comes into the translations for tanha is desire. Tanha means desire. Now, the missionaries assume the word means all desire, even for that which is good. They ignore the importance of chanda in Buddhism, which of course means the desire to act. It means good intention. You have a desire for good intention, for good motivation. No, some of the translations which equated tanha with desire then lead, well, then Buddhism means a path to indifference. Dixon countered this. He wouldn't have this. He stressed in one of his writings the Dasa Kusala Karma, the 10 wholesome deeds. And he translates them as very activist. There's not about indifference at all. You know, they're about compassion. They're about acting for society. For instance, he translates Dayavacha as the obligation of helping the helpless. A translation different from the one you usually get, which is about ritual and obligations and so on. But he's kind of giving it a positive twist. And it's in contestation of some of the more negative representations. And yes, the asavas. Now, this is another example of Gogoli's translations. And one tendency about some of the early translators is to avoid nuance, to avoid complexity by using desire as a key to other terms. For instance, Gogoli translated asava as desire. Now, asava is usually the corruptions that flow into the human being and which corrupt it, the inflows, and 3 are recognized in the text. Kamasava, corruption of sense desire, bhavasava, the corruption of desiring eternal existence, and the vijasava, the corruption of ignorance. They're not all about desire, particularly the last, but Gogoli kind of says, yes, it's all about desire, and reduces the total meaning. Then you get this reduction of meaning in translations. Right. How long have I got? But about 10 minutes, have I? Okay, not got many more terms to go through. But another quote from T.W. Rhys Davids to show the kind of dialogue that was happening between these different translators. It's a common blunder in English treatises on Buddhism that the Buddhist scriptures or Gautama himself inculcated the extinction of desire. There is not one passage in the Buddhist books to support so absurd a contention. Lusts, craving, longing, excitement, greed, all that lies at the root of that unworthy scramble for wealth and power or social position, so characteristic of the unchristian life of modern Christian cities, is undoubtedly condemned in many passages, and is even stated under the frequent simile of burning thirst to be the ultimate cause of sorrow. But the cultivation of right desires is an essential part of Buddhist ethics. So briefly to meditation, bhavana and jhana. Now, I wrote a whole article some years ago on how the British, all of them, in different categories, spoke about meditation in Sri Lanka and whether we can learn anything from it about how Buddhists meditated in the 19th century before Buddhist modernism took place. And there isn't time for me to give all of that. But what I found is that those with a Christian background, and it could be civil servants, it could be missionaries, could understand what it meant to meditate on an object, because they found that in Christianity. Meditating on the impurities of the body, meditating on anicca. Yes, they could understand that. It linked with something in their own background. But they had far more difficulty with the jhana. It's okay, samatha can lead to the jhana, but the jhanas themselves, for Clough, this is Benjamin Clough at the beginning of the century, and I think he got it more right than some of the others. He wrote, and he uses the Sanskrit dhyana, that Dhyana is that profound and abstract consideration which brings its object fully and undisturbedly before the mind, and is the favorite religious exercise of the Buddhistical ascetics, and practiced chiefly with a view to freeing the soul, notice he still brings the soul in, from all evil propensities. Yeah, come on. Oh, no, sorry. We'll try against the next one. That's it. Oh, no, no. Yeah, sorry. Going to Gogoli. Well, he linked jhana with mesmeric trance. Now, in Britain at the time, mesmerism was becoming popular, being hypnotized, and different forms of spiritualism, and he uses that vocabulary from Britain, that was popular in Britain, to kind of help him understand the jhana, or he thinks it helps him understand the jhana. He's happy with the idea of training or subjecting the mind, and that comes in his translations of the Dhammapada, and in some notes that I found at the Royal Asiatic Society that he made of the Anguttara Nikaya, that he's actually looking at the Anguttara Nikaya and seeing meditation which involves training and subjecting the mind. But he reduces things as well. Verse 181 of the Dhammapada has this phrase, Sambudhanam Natimatam. The usual translation is awakened and mindful. It's about meditation. It's about spiritual practice. Gogoli translates it as heroic and wise. Where did he get that? He's not understanding the discipline of meditation. And perhaps his monastic informants perhaps weren't either. And Rhys Davids, he wasn't a lot better. He was very good on Buddhism and active morality and a Buddhism activist. But in his early writings, he presents samadhi as a self-induced mesmeric trance, supposed to be the proof of superior holiness. He gets a bit late, he gets better later. But you see, these views influence translations. And the translators can't really understand the importance of spiritual work on the mind, that kind of spiritual practice, then their translations will be distorted. But to be fair to Rhys Davids, he does improve. So patterns, I'm coming to a close now. Patterns within the work of the translators. Well, they were very much aware of each other. I think I've shown that in my presentation. They contested and corrected each other. They also tested their work against some members of the monastic sangha who helped them. Perhaps sometimes didn't succeed in conveying everything. And in fact, some deficiencies in understanding when looked at from our century, the 21st century, could have been due to what the sangha then highlighted, the commentarial traditions. And I'll give you one example, and that's Gogoli and Appamada. I don't know how you would translate Appamada. It comes in the Dhammapada quite a lot, and of course right throughout the canon. Now, contemporary translators, most teachers now would say Appamada means wakefulness, carefulness, vigilance, earnestness, all the effort that you put into spiritual practice. Gogoli translated it as religion. So not, people must be earnest, but those who follow religion, which seems to be a reduction. So he translates appamadena as persevering religion. Now, I believe that Gogoli could have been told that Appamada conveyed all that the religion was about, that really it was the religion, Appamada. And then he takes this and so translates Appamada as religion in general. rather than the challenge of Appamada to any person who practices Buddhism. And he misses the link between Appamada and meditation. So translation going wrong between the monastic Sangha and the British also, I think, played a part. So what did these translators achieve? Of course, a translation, when it leaves the hands of translators, has a life of its own. Even the missionary translations, with their manipulation of terms, stimulated positive interest in Buddhism in the West. I think this is very important. They stimulated positive interest. For instance, a guy called William Knighton, who you probably haven't heard of, used Gogoli's translations to present Buddhism in a positive light as a philosophical religion whose primacy was sublime ethics and so on. And he's using Gogoli's translations. And I've just written an article on William Knighton because he's such a fascinating person, not a translator, but he's using the translations of others, again, to contest negative portrayals. But of course, the standard for translations become those connected with the Pali Text Society. And of course, that's another completely other presentation, which I'd have to do more research on. But the question of accuracy, and I've now put a question mark at the end of accuracy. I perhaps should have done that in the title as well. Accuracy is conditioned by the eyes of the perceiver. The missionaries felt they were accurate because their translations accorded to their own preconceptions on Buddhism. And all our translators believed their works were as accurate as they could make them. Some were willing to be corrected by others. Others saw their mission as doing this correcting. So it's this kind of dynamic process of different views about accuracy. And of course, in the 19th century, which is the main part I've been looking at, the use of diacriticals was still not settled. It was still very fluid. It didn't become really normative. The diacriticals that we link with Pali words now when they're rendered in Roman lettering, have been honed through many decades and were not finally settled really until the 20th century. And the Pali Text Society was central to this. So I suppose the final thought that I would like to leave with you is that accuracy is an ongoing process. It involves contest, it involves competition, it's messy, but it is a process and it is still an ideal that should be followed. So I can get to the final slide, which says, thank you. Thank you for listening, and I hope you've got some questions. Everyone's stunned into silence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I took a minute to come here because I unmuted the participants. Now the Zoom participants are now permitted to unmute and ask questions if they so wish to. Right. Thank you very much. And it was really fascinating, very academic presentation. And one wonders when today's climate, how many of Buddhists, really interested in Buddhism anyway, are learning Pali when it puts us to shame that there were so many who studied it. Obviously, they are all wanting to do so, whatever the reasons for wanting were, they did it. And the difficulties in translating Pali words remains. Whoever does that, because the Pali words are so pregnant with so much of meaning sometimes. Appamada, for example, I think when the Narada has said that's the one word that is only difficult to translate, even with a lot of words. So, and it's Pali similarity to Sinhala no doubt is there, but people think our Dukkha is our Sinhala Dukkha, which it's not. But because they are so, so deeply ingrained in their brain, they won't like to change. So Apam and Anatta is something that is difficult for many to understand, and they know the five aggregates. So it is no wonder that it was like that, and it means like that is not in the 19th century. So thank you very much, and I'm sure there are many who want to ask questions. Yeah. You want to ask a question?
Is it possible to stop sharing screen, please?
Thank you. I had three short questions. Have you come across any work on Buddhism done by the Portuguese and Dutch? Second question is, how did you colonialists initially learn Pali? Was it from a teacher? And how did they communicate because of the ignorance of the language of the native people? Third is, what was their motivation in publishing the translation of the Portuguese?
Okay, right. In terms of the Portuguese and Dutch, yes, the British who came did have publications and articles and forerunners to draw on about Buddhism in general. Not much in the way of formal translations, though. There was a Portuguese person called de Queiroz who wrote a treatise about the Portuguese in Sri Lanka, which included a section on Buddhism. But actually that was not, his book was lodged in Europe and it was not translated into English until the 20th century. But it now becomes a resource for how the Portuguese, or one remarkable Portuguese person, saw Buddhism. In the Dutch period, again, gosh, I wrote about this in my 2006 monograph, and I can't remember all of them, but there was some accounts of Buddhism by the Dutch. But again, the acts of translation, one quite important moment was when the Asiatic Society of Bengal was created in the 18th century, because this led to translation becoming important. And so some of the articles on Buddhism do contain translations. And so there's an enthusiasm about translations there, just coming in at the end of the 18th, the beginning of the 19th century. But people like Clough and his Sinhala dictionary, how did they learn, and how did the others learn? Well, mostly from members of the monastic Sangha. This is part of the hospitality of the monastic Sangha to the British who came. It's also part of the sadness of what happened. Because, Gogali was taught Pali by the monastic Sangha in Mathura, where he was posted. And no doubt these monks taught him in good faith. And then they later learned that he was using that knowledge to undermine Buddhism. So you've got this deep disappointment coming in to the teachers, at least of the missions. But then there were people like George Turner. Now, I've not mentioned George Turner because he didn't translate the texts. He translated the historical chronicles, the Mahavamsa. And he was actually taught and helped by members of the monastic Sangha. But he, of course, was always most respectful to Buddhism. And he speaks glowingly in his writings of the courtesy he's received from the monastic Sangha, because they know he respects Buddhism, because they know he is wanting to, translate for good purposes, good agendas. And so, and I think in my talk, I tried to show that there were very different agendas in those translators. With the Christian evangelical missionaries, zealous, pleasant people, no doubt, but their agenda was to undermine Buddhism, and sometimes their translations kind of reduced Buddhist concepts and so on. The civil servants, perhaps some of them thought, well, we need to understand Buddhism in order to rule, but they had, I think, greater respect for the tradition, although some of them came from Christian backgrounds. Rhys Davids never repudiated his Christian background. There's some quotes that I found, which is being a little bit kind of iffy, you know, yes, Buddhism has so much to give to the West, but, you know, I'm still a Christian, but these people were wanting to be positive about Buddhism. And then you've got the agenda of the Theosophists, who were coming to actually travel alongside Buddhists as brothers and sisters to push forward Buddhist revivalism and Buddhist education in Sri Lanka. But as Theosophists, they didn't always understand all of Buddhist terminology, such as anatta. Does that answer your questions? Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, or nothing? I so much have an understanding of Pali
Probably more than me.
More than a question, I wanted to thank you very much for this lecture, because I think at the time that the whole world, the Western population, turned into Buddhism when I'm seeking meaningful life. So therefore the translations are very important. And I think we solely appreciate the people who did the translations. And if they did not do the translations, it would have been by now, you know, accessible to a very, very small minority. But the difficulty, as you pointed out very well, in translation is it's a concept. You use the word concept. There are ideas, I would say there are experiences. For example, if you say Nibbana, if we have not experienced Nibbana, how we could accept
exactly.
Dukkha, for example, and this Buddha is the imagination terms. In the Dhammachakkapavаттana Sutta, uses the whole phrase to explain what dukkha is. Right?
Yes, yeah.
So we have to be very thankful for this translation. We may not be perfect, that's fine. But the first translation gives us a stepping stone. That's not exact. Then let's come up with a better one. But one translation that bothers me is the translation for metta. I'm so thankful for the first translation, loving kindness.
Yeah.
But I ask myself, is there love in metta in the traditional meaning of love? And is it kindness? It's not kindness. Metta is like, may all things be well and happy. It is that mental quality of wishing everyone well, not kindness per se, because that is for those who are in some kind of trouble. So I feel it's time to think of an alternative word for that. I apologize for questioning the translation like that, but I thought it's an opportunity to get your expert views
on metta. I think, yes, thank you for raising that. I mean, it didn't come into my talk at all, you know, metta or karuna. I think loving kindness was chosen as a translation to avoid the attachment that is sometimes linked with the concept of love. You know, I can remember one Buddhist friend when I was studying Buddhism in Sri Lanka 40 years ago, saying, I can't use the term love in connection with Buddhism because there's always attachment created to love in a loving relationship. And I think so. So loving kindness, I think, was a way of bringing metta away from being attached to those you are showing metta towards. But I agree with you, it still might not be the right translation. An expansive heart it concerns the expansion of the heart, doesn't it, towards people throughout the world, wishing them well. Perhaps you need several sentences to actually define and interpret metta. Because, yeah, I agree with you. Loving kindness, again, doesn't encompass the whole of metta, does it? It is larger. It is a larger concept than loving kindness. Yeah.
Participants, do you have any?
I don't think I can see anyone. I can't see anyone on this screen about if they want to ask questions. It may be.
Yeah.
I think if you stop sharing the screen, you'll be able to see all the participants.
Don De Silva is talking. Wait.
Yeah, if you stop sharing the screen, it would be good to see the participants.
No, we can't hear you. Can you wait until we get a better reception and then?
Thank you very much for that.
Can you- Yeah, can you stop scaring the screen? That's what he said.
I mean, I always had the impression that there were some double standards involved in some of the translation. And I think what so much.
Yeah, his screen should come right.
I have to say thank you very much for ending your talk by saying that it's an ongoing project. It's translation, because my view is supported by so much help. Because there are no single words to translate, but it's a concept. And it's something that's got to be understood. And very often when monks try to translate in Dharma, they say it's like saying, how do you describe the taste of sugar? Now, unless you are actually tasted sugar, you can't have one word to translate what it means, right? Because then the word sweet comes into mind. But unless you have tasted sugar, you don't know what it is. So I actually said it's an ongoing project. But then I have to say that although I was born a Buddhist, I attended a Buddhist school and I have been, studying Buddhism and listening to Buddhist songs all my life. I still have a problem with the term anartha. So I think it requires a person to actually attain enlightenment to truly understand the meaning of anartha. And I guess one has to attain enlightenment to really understand the meaning of nirvana. Because otherwise it's speculation as to what it is. Because people may think that they experience God, that's some form of nirvana, which it is not. So thank you very much for this talk, and there are some other thing I have to say about the age of 81, I lost it. But which is Manicha. Thank you.
No, thank you very much for